want to welcome everyone tonight. My name is Carson, and I am the museum assistant and educator at the Lacey Museum. This evening, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The museum is on traditional territory of the Coastal Salish people, specifically in the Nisqually and Saxon Island people. Lacey and the South Puget Sound region are encompassed by the Treaty of Medicine Creek, signed under us in 1854. We respect and affirm tribal sovereignty as part of the city of Lacey. We work with Nisqually and Saxon Island tribes in a government-to-government partnerships. Before we begin this program, I kind of also wanted to share a little bit of museum news for everybody. First off is that our museum is open. We are open Thursdays and Fridays from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. and Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. But we do have a couple of closures coming up, so I wanted to make sure to mention those tonight. We're going to be closed tomorrow for Veterans Day, and then we're going to be closed November 25th through the 27th for Thanksgiving Day weekend as well. And I also wanted to mention that we actually have 2 new exhibits at the museum right now. Our first exhibit is called Righting a Wrong, Japanese Americans in World War II. It is now open, and this is an exhibit from the Smithsonian Traveling Poster exhibit. And then our second exhibit is called From Parlor to the Podium, and this is an exhibit all about women's suffrage. Both of these exhibits will be on display at the Lacey Museum until May 2022. So make sure you head on over to the Lacey Museum to check it out. And then just giving a little update on some of the other things we're doing at the museum. We are working on a project called Collecting COVID. And this project is supposed to help document kind of the pandemic and what we've all been doing during this time. So we've been asking people to submit some of their photos and share what they've been doing during the pandemic. And these are just a few of the examples of some of the photos we've collected. Our first photo on the left was submitted by Cynthia Pratt, and the photo on the right was submitted by Jennifer Ruffner. And they demonstrate some of the hobbies some people have done during COVID to stay entertained. So if you have any photos you'd like to submit, you can go to laceymuseum.org and send us in your photos, and it might show up in one of our history talks. And before we begin tonight's presentation, I would like to share another event in our History Talks series coming in December. On Wednesday, December 8th at 6:30 p.m., our speaker will be Dr. William Woodward, a professor of American and Pacific Northwest history at Seattle Pacific University, in a presentation called Guarding the South Sound, Homeland Security the Old-Fashioned Way. Dr. Woodward will discuss the history and the formation of the National Guard of Washington, and will explain how the Guard's dual mission continues to serve the state and nation in the 21st century. Join us for this unique presentation. And I also wanted to make a note about this upcoming history talk, that this history talk won't be, or our upcoming history talk in December will not be recorded. So make sure you register early for this event to get those reminders so you don't miss it. And we're hoping that our talk in December will be an in-person online hybrid, but we're having to keep an eye on what all of the policies are to keep everyone safe. So keep an eye out on our website and our Facebook page for more information. Like with all of our history talks, you can register for any future programs on our website at laceymuseum.org and click the events page. Alternatively, you can visit the City of Lacey Facebook page where our speaker events are also posted. And lastly, I would just like to mention that if you've been to any of our history talk presentations before, you know that the Q&A portion is usually a highlight for a lot of our viewers. And so tonight we will also be having a question and answer portion. At the bottom of your screens, we should have a Q&A button. And if you have any questions that pop up during the talk, just go ahead and submit them in that Q&A button. And at the end, we'll circle back to those questions and see if we can get to everybody. What we kind of experimented with last time was to see how it worked with people coming up and actually asking their questions via video, and it worked out pretty well. So we're going to try and do that again tonight. If you don't want to have your video on, or you don't want to present your question that way, just make a note of that in that question, and I can read it for you guys, no problem. And now that I've talked a lot, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for tonight. Tonight's speaker is Michael Mays. Dr. Michael Mays is a former Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs and currently a professor of English and the director of the Hanford History Project at Washington State University, Tri-Cities. A native Washingtonian, he spent 19 years as a professor and department chair of English at the University of Southern Mississippi. In addition to numerous articles on Irish history and culture, he is an author or co-author of 3 books: World War I and the Cultures of Modernity, Nation States, the Cultures of Irish Nationalism, and Global Crossroads, a World Literature Reader. His most recent book, Legacies of the Manhattan Project, Reflections on 75 Years of Nuclear World, was published as Volume 2 in the WSU Hanford's History Book Series in August. Dr. Mays, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're super excited to hear your talk.
Thank you, Carson, and thank you, Aaron and Kelly, for the help here, getting us oriented to get going. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's really a great pleasure. And when I say being here, obviously, I mean here on Zoom. I was really looking forward to seeing people in person, but that remains for another day. Sometime soon, I hope, we will be back to having these talks and interactions in person. But I do very much appreciate your interest and your participation in this history talk. I'd like to thank the staff here at the Lacey Museum for kindly inviting me to share with you some stories regarding what has become for me very much a labor of love. I'm not typically inclined to spend a lot of time delving into biographical details. I am really reluctant to do that, but in this case, I think it has some instructive value where Hanford is concerned. Excuse me. One of the primary projects we've been involved with at the Hanford History Project has been the collection of oral histories pertaining to Hanford. Our oral history solicitations read, "What is your Hanford story?" Well, very briefly, this is my Hanford story. I grew up in Washington. I lived on both sides of the state in a variety of places. We moved around a lot. I have family on both sides of the state. I spent my summers from the age of 14 until I was into my late 20s working on my grandfather's wheat farm in the Palouse. Excuse me. And so my point here is that we crisscrossed the state a lot. And a lot of those trips would take us through the Tri-Cities. Never to the Tri-Cities, mind you, but definitely through the Tri-Cities. I took Washington State history in high school. Bear with me, there's a point here, I promise. I went to college in Tacoma, graduate school in Seattle. So I'm a Washingtonian through and through. When I finished graduate school, I got my first university teaching job in the Deep South. As it happens, Carson and I share a connection here. My first teaching job was at the University of Southern Mississippi, as she mentioned. I was there for 19 years, loved it. But that was the first time I'd ever lived anywhere for any length of time outside the state of Washington. So let's jump ahead 18 years or so. And I've been offered an administrative and faculty position at WSU's Tri-Cities campus. Going home, I think to myself, what's it like? My wife, who is from Alabama, asks, I've got nothing. I'd actually only set foot in the Tri-Cities twice, for a grand total of maybe 8 hours altogether. So my wife goes to work, as she's wont to do, and gets back to me a day or two later. You know what went on there? She asked me. That's where they produced the plutonium for the Fat Boy bomb during the Manhattan Project. And proceeds to tell me everything we weren't taught in Washington State history about Hanford, the Manhattan Project, nuclear stockpiles, and nuclear cleanup. The irony that my wife, did I mention she's from Alabama? had to teach me, a proud native Washingtonian, about what went on here was not lost on me. Now, to be fair, and if we could move to the next slide, please. Those of us of a certain age remember the veil of secrecy which shrouded Hanford, not only during the war years, but for decades after. Do not stop, the signs on 240 commanded as we passed through the desert late at night. It was, to say the least, creepy. That Hanford might one day be, as it is today, part of the National Park Service was at that time utterly unthinkable. When I arrived at WSU in 2012, one of the very first things I did was create the Hanford History Project, as much to catch myself up on the gap in my own history as to facilitate the research of others. The timing proved to be fortuitous. Tours of Reactor had begun, records were becoming more widely available, and interest generally was on the ascent. There was a role to play, but much of the heavy lifting had already begun. So just briefly, I'll tell you a little bit about the Hanford History Project. The Hanford History Project at WSU Tri-Cities was established in 2014 to collect, preserve, and interpret the history of Hanford, the Tri-Cities, and the greater Mid-Columbia region. We fulfill these objectives in a variety of ways, some of which include housing and managing the Department of Energy's Hanford collection, which comprises approximately 3,000 Hanford Site artifacts, as well as archival materials dating from 1943 to 1990, from the beginning of the Manhattan Project to the end of the Cold War. We maintain our own collection of community artifacts and archival and photographic collections. We have a very robust oral history program. We support scholarly research and academic publications. We partner with WSU Press on its Hanford Histories book series. We have recently established the Washington Wine History Initiative to capture and collect the history of the wine industry in Washington. And finally, through educational outreach activities, curricular development, and in partnerships and collaborations with like-minded local, regional, and national organizations. Excuse me. The Hanford History Project's mission is to both facilitate and promote scholarly research across a broad range of disciplines, and to support and encourage public history through a broad range of community activities and events, including lectures, seminars, conferences, workshops, and lifelong learning opportunities. In supporting both academic research and public history, we aspire to document the diverse historical influences that have shaped our region, beginning with the Ice Age floods and continuing through the migration stories of its indigenous Native American and pioneering European settler communities. Hanford's role in the Manhattan Project and Cold War, and up to its ongoing role in delivering cutting-edge science and engineering in the areas of waste remediation and environmental sciences. As a public-facing academic unit at WSU, we are uniquely positioned to partner with and add value to many different community groups, government agencies, other academic and research institutions, and others who share our interest in documenting and advancing knowledge of the extraordinary scientific, cultural, and political achievements at Hanford. In particular, we work closely with the Department of Energy, the National Park Service, and the Tri-Cities National Park Committee to support their respective missions with regard to the Hanford unit of the recently created Manhattan Project National Historical Park. We recently completed a 2-year collaboration with the Pacific West Regional Office of the National Park Service and Tri-Cities African American Community, Cultural, and Education Society on a project titled Documenting African American Migration, Segregation, and Civil Rights History at Manhattan Project National Historical Park, Hanford. In 2017, we hosted an international conference called Legacies of the Manhattan Project, Reflections on 75 Years of a Nuclear World, with more than 100 participants from 6 different countries. And in 2020, we published Volume 2 in the Hanford History Series, a collection of essays by the same name, many of which were presented at that conference. Additionally, WSU's location on the edge of the Hanford Site in the Tri-Cities Research District presents opportunities to regularly engage with and support the work of the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, or LIGO, the Department of Energy, the National Park Service, the Port of Benton, Northwest Public Broadcasting, the Richland and Mid-Columbia Libraries, and the Reach Museum and Interpretive Center. Many, many great community partners out there, both locally and across the state and in the region. So I'll be talking tonight about some of the many legacies, and there are many, bequeathed to us by the Manhattan Project. I'll be focusing mainly, though not exclusively, on those legacies which are unique to Hanford. Much of what I'll talk about is drawn from research carried out by my colleagues at WSU and contributors to the first 3 volumes of the Hanford History's book series I edit for WSU Press. But before I get to those, I thought it might be helpful to provide a brief review of the Manhattan Project and its origins, its significance, and its scale of operations, especially at Hanford. So when the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service attacked the United States on the morning of December 7th, 1941, the research program, which would come to be known as the Manhattan Project, was in its infancy. Though he had been made aware that German scientists were attempting to develop the world's first atomic bomb as early as August 1939, it was not until October 1941, a mere 2 months before Pearl Harbor, that President Roosevelt finally approved the United States' own atomic program. In the urgent aftermath of the bombing, as the United States declared war first on Japan and then on Germany, work in the S1 section of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, the so-called Uranium Committee, intensified considerably. As research into plutonium, first discovered by Glenn Seaborg in February 1941 and pictured in this slide, and nuclear reactor technology began to coalesce at the University of Chicago's Metallurgical Laboratory in early 1942, planning for the massive construction effort was underway in, of all places, a nondescript high-rise office building overlooking City Hall Park in the heart of New York City. And just as an aside, I don't know about you, but I always wondered, why was it called the Manhattan Project, for goodness sake? So this was sort of an interesting little, detour for me it may be well known, but it was not to me. That was an unlikely location, to be certain. But there were several distinct advantages as well. First, given their experience with management of large-scale construction projects, the Army Corps of Engineers had been chosen to build the production facilities, and the Corps' North Atlantic Division was in the same building. In addition, the offices on the 18th floor, which served as temporary headquarters, were in close proximity to the Manhattan office of the principal project contractor. The location was close to Columbia University, where much of the nuclear research continued to take place. And finally, there were resources galore, an abundance of piers to import uranium and other needed ores, warehouses to store them, laboratories to split the atoms, and an unmatched pool of highly skilled, well-educated military and civilian workers, about 5,000 of whom were employed on the project over time. In June 1942, Colonel James C. Marshall was chosen to head the Army's effort, which was initially named the Laboratory for the Development of Substitute Materials. Marshall proved to be ineffectual in his role, and he was soon replaced by Colonel Leslie Groves, seen in this slide with Robert Oppenheimer. Groves feared the project's original name would draw undue attention to itself. He opted instead to utilize the Corps' standard procedure for naming new operations according to the city in which they were located. Development of Substitute Materials henceforth became Manhattan Engineer District, MED, and then, in time, Manhattan Project, or more simply yet, Manhattan. Unlike other Corps districts, however, the MED had no geographical boundaries. Rightly so, as despite the many benefits of the New York City location, there were also acute limitations. What Paris had been to the 18th century and London to the 19th, so Manhattan was to the first half of the 20th century, the dynamic global center of finance and fashion, art and architecture, business and industry, the bustling, vibrant place to be. Excuse me. The place to be, however, was singularly unsuitable for a top secret government project requiring vast amounts of space, abundant natural resources, and substantial population-free buffer zones to mitigate safety and security concerns. Hence, Groves aggressively went to work identifying and securing the sites to which Manhattan would be dispersed. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where uranium would be processed in September 1942. Los Alamos, New Mexico, where it happened Oppenheimer already had a ranch, where much of the research was conducted and the bombs assembled in November of 1942. And of course, Hanford, where plutonium was to be produced in February 1943. As these remote and far-flung nuclear enclaves grew, so Manhattan's role shrank. In 1943, just a little more than a year after it was established, Manhattan Engineer District headquarters were relocated to Oak Ridge. The decision to relocate the project, the physical decentering of the Manhattan Project from Manhattan, was pragmatic and its impact minimal. The eventual psychological shockwave brought by the new nuclear program, its ontological decentering, to use some fancy words, if you will, was of another order altogether, shattering core beliefs and values. That crisis would come in time, soon, and without advance warning. But for the moment, some individual New Yorkers continued to play significant parts in the wartime effort. The story of Groves hiring Oppenheimer to direct Project WWII is well known. Less well known, today anyway, is another hire the general made, that of William L. Atomic Bill Lawrence, Pulitzer Prize-winning science writer for the New York Times, handpicked by Groves to document the Manhattan Project. And the slide here shows Groves with Lawrence. When Lawrence, the only journalist to witness both the Trinity test and the bombing of Nagasaki, was dispatched from New York to Los Alamos in April 1945, Manhattan remained the brash epicenter of the civilized world. It's unlikely many of Lawrence's fellow cosmopolites could easily have located New Mexico on a map. But there, in the desert near Alamogordo, quote, in a burst of flame that illuminated earth and sky for a brief span that seemed eternal, Lawrence witnessed the birth of the atomic age. The quote is from Lawrence. Though few were aware at the time, nothing would ever be the same again. By the time he returned to New York, just a few short months later, the whole world would know the news, largely thanks to Lawrence himself, who reported on it for the Times. The consequence of that news, what it meant, was much more difficult to convey or digest in the immediate aftermath. But in Lawrence's journey from Times Square, really the center of the center, to the New Mexico periphery, we glimpse the advent of the nuclear age, the transformation of a world measured by size and scope and scale and strength, to a world measured by the sophistication of one's technologies and characterized by the always imminent threat of apocalypse. As Lawrence had been one of the first to understand, suddenly, in that eternal instant of Trinity's burst of flame, Manhattan had become the past, while Manhattan, the project, heralded the future. Now, the first two sites had already been determined. Oak Ridge was Groves's headquarters. Los Alamos was chosen primarily because it was in proximity to Oppenheimer's ranch, but the third site remained to be determined. And when Groves sent his number two, Colonel Franklin T. Matthias, and DuPont engineers to scout for the third of the three Manhattan Project sites in December of 1942, he listed several key criteria that they should be on the lookout for. First, a large and remote tract of land, a hazardous manufacturing area of at least 12 by 16 miles, space for laboratory facilities at least 8 miles from the nearest reactor or separations plant, no towns of more than 1,000 people closer than 20 miles from the hazardous rectangle, no main highway, railway, or employee village closer than 10 miles, 16 kilometers from the hazardous rectangle, a clean and abundant water supply, a large electrical power supply, and ground that could bear heavy loads. And I'll just emphasize that clean and abundant water supply was almost without question at the top of the list. So Carson, if you could just move to the next slide, it will give us one more. Yeah, there we go. So this gives you a little bit of a sense of where, it doesn't show you exactly where that Hanford site is. That, I think we've got another picture of that, but coming up. But you see the Columbia River, you see the original towns of White Bluffs and Hanford there. And if you were today to drive from Richland down across the Columbia River, you'd follow along Rattlesnake Mountain there, going in a sort of, towards the upper right corner of your screen. And you would cross the river down at Vernita, following along the Hanford site, pretty much the entire way. You'd cross at Vernita, and then you would follow the river down about 20, 25 miles to Vantage, where you would cross the river again and head back on I-90 towards Seattle if you were going that direction, or you go east towards Spokane. The site, as most of you probably know, is 586 square miles. And as Matthias reported, Hanford was ideal in virtually all respects, except for the farming towns of White Bluffs and Hanford. But when Groves visited the site in January 1943, he established the Hanford Engineer Works, codenamed Site W, and the federal government quickly acquired the land under its War Powers Authority and relocated some 1,500 residents of Hanford, White Bluffs, and nearby settlements, as well as the Wanam people, Confederated Tribes and bands of the Yakima Nation, and the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation and the Nez Perce Tribe. The story of these evictions of these communities who were relocated is recounted in volume 1 of the Hanford Histories series, Nowhere to Remember, Hanford, White Bluffs, and Richland to 1943, written and edited by my colleagues, Robert Bauman and Robert Franklin. And I just want to point out while we're on this slide, you see, you don't see the Hanford site again, that's coming up, but you see White Bluffs situated on the river there, Hanford situated on the river there, and the Hanford site and B reactor are, those areas became the location for the camp, the construction camp, and I'll get to that shortly, but B reactor is down there about where the Columbia River, where the Columbia River is identified as the Columbia River. And its proximity to that massive amount of free-flowing fresh water was was the determining factor for why this location was so perfect for what the government was looking for. So I'll just have you keep that in mind as we go on, because the river is going to factor back into this again also. So Carson, maybe if you would, we can just kind of move through these next slides, give you a little bit of a sense that, in fact, though it seemed as though there was nothing here, as though this was a sort of wasteland that was, you know, perfect for setting up this massive government complex. There were people who suffered from this dislocation, and many of whom had come there and who had planted orchards, and who had, many of whom were on their third or fourth year with orchards that and other crops that were finally about to bear crops that they could take to market. When the government enacted these evictions, they compensated people based on the taxes that they had paid the previous year. And so for many of these people, they had put in all this work to get their crops up or their orchards up, and they hadn't had any income because it takes 3 or 4 years for crops to come to fruition. And so when they were evicted, they hadn't paid taxes, and they pleaded to be allowed to harvest their crops, you know, to just let them stay on through summer in order to be able to take these first crops to market, to sort of enjoy the fruits of their labor, if you will. And the government simply said, no, you need to clear out immediately. Okay, so Carson, if you would, you can go ahead and scroll through the next couple of slides, and you just see here is the Planters Hotel in Hanford, and you know, so there were thriving little communities here that were just simply, you know, people were moved off the land, and the buildings and the structures were demolished. And there are 4 structures that remain from the pre-1943 era on the Hanford site. And if you have an opportunity at some point, you can come over and you can do a tour. The Department of Energy and the National Park Service offer 2 tours, one of Reactor and one of the cultural sites. And if you do the cultural sites, you'll go and you'll see the White Bluffs Bank and the Brueggemann Warehouse and so forth, a couple of other sites. And it's really quite fascinating. But in any case, the construction of the massive and challenging Hanford Engineer Works, and if you can go ahead and this will give you, so that's, there we go. Just hold on that one for just a second, if you would, Carson. So that area in orange and yellow and green is the Hanford site. You can see where it is on the map, on the Washington State map above, 586 square miles. And it doesn't really, I don't know whether you can really see the 100 reactor areas and all of those down there where the 100s are in the, you know, sort of upper left corner. That's the Columbia River, and that's where nearly all of the reactors were located. Thank you. So construction of the massive and challenging Hanford Engineering Works commenced in March of 1943. The challenges were exacerbated by the remote location and the fact that so many men and women were already engaged in the war effort at home and abroad. DuPont advertised for workers in newspapers for an unspecified, quote, war construction project in southeastern Washington, offering attractive scale of wages and living facilities. Before the government evictions, about 6,700 people lived along the 30-mile stretch of the Columbia River between Hover and White Bluffs. By June of 1944, when employment levels peaked, the construction camp at Hanford was home to 51,000 people from 47 states, the majority of them past draft age, but still young enough to help build the huge industrial complex. And you can go ahead and forward to the next slide, please. Thank you, Carson. Construction on both the camp itself and the nuclear facilities proceeded at breakneck speed. In just 18 months, between March of 1943 and September of 1944, both the camp and B reactor were built. It took just 9 months from the time the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers broke ground on B reactor in October 1943 until the reactor went critical on September 26th, 1944. I think my math's a little wrong there. That would be 11 months. But the camp, deemed the world's largest trailer park, would eventually be home to 131 men's barracks, 64 women's barracks, 8 mess halls, separate beer halls for men and women, an auditorium, a movie theater, butcher shop, grocery store, Sears outlet, hospital, post office, and a bus system more extensive than that of the city of Chicago. You just think about that, 51,000 people. That's just a little bit short of the number of people who live in Richland currently. It was a massive operation and really unprecedented in the history of American construction or operations. By the end of the war, in August of 1945, Hanford's construction forces would build 554 buildings, 386 miles of road, 158 miles of railroad, 3 massive chemical plants, and the world's first 3 production scale nuclear reactors. Remarkably, most who worked on the site had no idea what they were building, only that what they were doing had been deemed essential for the frantic effort to win the war. Despite the secrecy shrouding the enterprise and the draconian security measures put in place to keep that secrecy intact, most workers, or at least those who stayed anyway, and many didn't, felt intense pride in the part they were playing in the nation's war effort. Hanford workers sought to support the troops not only through their labor, but in other ways as well. And so if we could advance the slide. There we go. One more. There we go. Thank you. The same patriotic spirit that inspired the swift construction of the site and its facilities gave rise to another remarkable effort, a worker-driven campaign to, quote, give a day's pay and send a bomber on its way. Carpenter Max Blanchard is generally credited with coming up with the idea for buying a warplane to send overseas. Shortly after the D-Day landing of June 6, 1944, Blanchard received a letter from his son, who was fighting overseas. The letter was full of praise for the offensive support the troops received from the air. Blanchard knew then that a plane was the right gift for the Army and that it would be appreciated more than anything else. Blanchard told his crew about his idea, and they quickly spread the word. Soon, the whole Hanford site was enthusiastically supporting the idea of buying the war machine. Over the course of the next month, the payroll department collected a day's pay from each of some 51,000 employees. And here you see a woman christening the day's pay. The Give a Bomber Committee held a contest to pick a name for the plane, and 11 people submitted the name Day's Pay. Since the campaign was conducted under the slogan, give a day's pay and send a bomber on its way, all employees who contributed to the cause received a certificate acknowledging their share of the bomber. On July 23rd, 1944, the $300,000 B-17 paid for by Hanford workers was christened at the site. So patriotism unites. Patriotism drove the construction effort. It drove the expression of support manifested in the day's pay. But patriotism, it brings us together to achieve great things. But as we've come to know, patriotism harbors a dark side as well, fear. And fear, especially after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, was ascendant as the United States was drawn into the Second World War. I'll talk just briefly about one example very close to home for those of us here in the Tri-Cities. The Yamuchi family from Pasco. This is a story recounted by my colleague, WSU history professor, Dr. Robert Bauman, in the Hanford History Project's recently released third volume, Echoes of Exclusion and Resistance, Voices from the Hanford Region. As Bauman tells the story, the Yamuchi family, Harry, wife Chika, and oldest daughter Lou, settled in Pasco in 1907, where, for nearly 4 decades, the Yamuchis and their 9 children were viewed as exemplary American citizens and business people. World War II changed things. Following Roosevelt's Executive Order 9006, which ordered the removal of all people of Japanese descent in February of 1942, members of the Yamuchi family were among the 120,000 Japanese Americans imprisoned during the war. The boundary line for the evacuation of Japanese Americans in eastern Washington was the Columbia River. People on the Benton County side of the river were ordered to internment camps, while those on the Franklin County side were supposed to be able to stay. Harry and Chika, despite residing in Franklin County, were sent to an internment camp in Arkansas because they were Japanese nationals and he was a prominent businessman. Their son Charles was not interned because he was an American citizen and lived in Franklin County. Daughter Chiyoko Yamuchi Minatoya and her husband and daughters were sent to the internment camp at Hart Mountain, Wyoming, while son George Yamuchi, a student at the University of Washington, and his wife Maddie were sent to Minidoka in Idaho. He would eventually gain his release by enlisting in the U.S. Army, where he served in the 442nd Combat Unit in Italy. As a result of George's enlistment, his wife Maddie was allowed to return to Pasco. Home on furlough from the Army in December of 1943, George Yamuchi wrote a letter to the editor of the local newspaper asking, quote, "What does it mean to be an American? Is he white, black, yellow, red, or any other certain color?" he continued. "It is generally conceded that he is any one of these or a mixture of them all. That is one of the principles of our Constitution, is it not?" Poignant and timely questions still. As Bauman concludes, quote, "To Yamuchi, being an American citizen meant, in part, fighting for his country." And this is George Yamuchi here. "And exercising his freedom of speech and using the freedom of the press at a time when he and other family members had experienced hatred, imprisonment, and bigotry." His poignant plea, "What is an American?" and his answer demonstrate ways non-whites in Pasco and the Tri-Cities challenged racial prejudice. His eloquent words and heartfelt message remain just as relevant and important in the 21st century when migrant children are held in prison camps and racial discrimination and violence remain central to the experiences of non-whites as they were in 1943, end quote. Now, just as patriotism proved to be both a source of unification and a source of division, so the urgency of the war effort generated unintended consequences that were both positive and negative as well. I'll turn now to 2 representative examples drawn from the Legacies collection. We're all aware of what a remarkable scientific achievement the Manhattan Project represents, even if we may not fully grasp all the complexities of the science itself, which I certainly do not. But even if some parts of the story are far better remembered than others, Oppenheimer and Fermi, for example, are featured in countless histories of the period. Glenn Seaborg, not so much. But nuclear science wasn't the only new discipline that emerged in the wake of the Manhattan Project. On the contrary, as the contributors to Legacies of the Manhattan Project would have us recall, the novelty of the new atomic age of necessity ushered in scores of new fields of study. Implosion physics, for example, and medical and health physics were necessary responses to unique challenges faced by the project scientists and engineers as they raced to fulfill their mission of constructing a nuclear weapon. Any number of those stories are compelling in their own right. Those I've chosen to conclude with tonight offer a sort of trajectory from past to present to future. I'll begin then with the legacy David P.D. Munns documents in his essay in the collection called "The Atom Goes to College: The Teaching Reactors That Trained the Atomic Age." As Munns contends, compared to the extensive accounts devoted to the atomic nuclear scientists, the role of the nuclear engineers in the development of the atomic bomb, first with the atomic piles and then the vast enterprise of the nuclear industry, remains understudied and underappreciated. After the success of the Trinity test and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and with a Cold War turning increasingly hot, the proverbial genie of nuclear fission was out of its bottle, and there would be no putting it back. The question of how and whom would manage it is what Munns' essay explores. The Atomic Energy Commission, the civilian agency created by Harry Truman in 1946 to oversee the peacetime development of atomic science and technology, provided facilities and funds. What it did not provide, Munns writes, was expertise. The precipitous growth of the nuclear industry presented significant challenges. None were greater than the severe shortage of experienced nuclear operators, technicians, and engineers. Nuclear power stations were forced to recruit people from coal and oil plants with minimal training, creating the impression that nuclear power plants were, to quote Richard Rhodes, quote, designed by geniuses and operated by idiots. Rhodes's retort indirectly highlights the essential challenge: how to go about training a workforce with the expertise to match the scope and scale of the heretofore unimagined industry. The bulk of that work would be shouldered in the post-war years by the nation's colleges and universities. During the height of the Cold War, and here we see two students chatting at the nuclear reactor in Pullman on the WSU campus. The bulk of that work would be shouldered in the post-war years by the nation's colleges and universities. During the height of the Cold War from 1949 to the late 1970s, nearly 150 university programs and more than 24 reactors sprang up on campuses across the country, Munns notes, adding that their emergence represents one of the key legacies of the Manhattan Project. Those programs taught the advanced technical skills and knowledge needed to supply the new experts of the post-war era, to be sure. Quoting Munns, undergirding the multiple infrastructures of weapons, power plants, and radioisotopes were legions of trained nuclear engineers, scientists, technologists, and technicians. But the programs did much more than simply train a vast new labor pool, Munns contends. They instilled the values and habits of mind of the new atomic age. In learning, quote, how to operate the complex economic, social, and military infrastructure of the state that always threatened to run out of control, end quote, what students gained from their education and experience above all, he writes perceptively, was the knowledge and assurance that they could administer their modernist state. Munns' story of the rise of the brand new field of nuclear engineering, invented, as it were, on the fly, reflects the optimistic strain of post-war American exceptionalism, the can-do spirit of the age. But of course, there were gloomier and more uncertain conditions to contend with as well. Radiation exposure, both at home and abroad, the growing levels of radioactive waste, and the deleterious environmental impacts of decades of plutonium production all foretold the monumental challenges to come. Whether motivated by her years spent witnessing uncertainty firsthand as the historian of the Hanford Site, or perhaps opting for another alternative, Michelle Gerber, in Hanford Production Reactor Operations and Contamination in the Columbia River, offers a bracingly fact-based report on the inability of scientists to mitigate the release of radiological and chemical contaminants into the Columbia River. That failure, as Gerber argues, severely affected aquatic life and the entire food chain. And if we just look at this picture here, you see what Gerber is talking about, and again, why the reactors were located where they were located, and why the river was so important is that these reactors, and as I'll get to here in just a minute, they were pulling water out of the Columbia River, running them through the reactors, moving them to cooling tanks, and then running the cooled water back out into the river. So that this picture gives you a good sort of visual of how, you can see the proximity of the way that the river was, that the reactors were situated in relation to the river for just that reason. So to cite just a couple of Gerber's examples, indicating the scope of that production and the challenges it presented. Between 1944 and 1963, 9 nuclear reactors were brought online at Hanford. During that time, water usage by all reactors per day increased from 1.29 billion gallons in 1945 to 5 billion gallons in 1955 to 9.76 billion gallons. And remember, this is per day, 9.76 billion gallons per day in 1964 when production peaked. Increased production meant more and more contaminants in the effluent discharges. But it also meant increasingly higher temperatures of the water being returned to the Columbia and its ecosystem. From 149 degrees Fahrenheit during World War II to 194 degrees Fahrenheit in 1956 to 203 degrees Fahrenheit in 1964. Just imagine that, 203 degrees Fahrenheit water being returned back out into the Columbia River. Increased river temperatures, one report stated, constitute the greatest potential threat to the local salmon. Despite their repeated efforts and the implementation of a broad range of strategies, there was little the Hanford scientists could do, Gerber concludes, but wait for reactor operations to abate. And remarkably, quoting her, by the late 1970s, the volume of effluent discharges to the Columbia River stood at less than 0.2% of 1964 high levels. Now, it would be nice to end this talk on that hopeful note, with the implication that just maybe the river and the whole Hanford site has an infinite capacity for self-healing over time. But it would also be a naive, if not altogether duplicitous note to end on. It would require ignoring current global political tensions surrounding the question of which countries will or will not be allowed to be nuclear states. Closer to home, it would require ignoring the ongoing $2 billion plus per annum cleanup at the Hanford site a mission many expect to continue for at least another half century. Most immediately, it would require overlooking the complex legacies, for good and ill, the contributors to our legacies volume so assiduously described. As they attest, we live still in the immense shadow of the Manhattan Project. If that past still shapes us, however, the futures we imagine and create will be of our own making. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Mays, for such a fascinating talk. I definitely learned a lot through this conversation. So let me see if I can get our screen so we can pull up the questions and see what our audience has. All right, let's see. I have a question here from Virginia Town. I'm gonna go ahead and see if she'll answer or ask the question. Sorry about that. All right, so Virginia's question asks, it was actually more of a comment. It said her grandfather wasn't paid more than the price for his crops. He lived there with his wife, who was sick with TB from 1909. Her children were born at the oasis that he had created for her. 2 of them died there. He kept the town fed during the Depression and sent his daughters to college and said that land was never used. So, and let's see, we have another question that popped up. This is by Mary Wilkinson. Mary, I'm going to go ahead and ask the question just because we're having some of these technical difficulties. But she said that she was a Hanford baby here, born in January 1945 in the Hanford Hospital, irradiated in 1949 Green Run. And she asked if you can discuss the human impact legacy.
Oh boy. Well, Mary, that's a huge question, isn't it? So, and I'm sorry that we don't, because I'd like to sort of ask you a question back. I'm curious if what your question is your question about the human impact of the people who were dislocated from the site, or is it about the human impact more generally? Because, the human impacts were huge, of course. I mean, as we talked about earlier, the people who, whether your families had been on, in Hanford and White Bluffs from, 1907 or 1909 or 1942, it was incredibly disruptive to, have the amount of time that people were given, the notice that they were given was incredibly short. In some cases, people who lived out of town may have had as little as 2 weeks notice if they weren't getting the daily newspaper, or if they weren't privy to to the news of the town, traded over, at the grocery store or the bank. People were told you have 2 weeks to pack up and move. Well, move where, first of all, and with what? Some people were better able to do that than others. Some people, we've interviewed in our oral histories people who talked about their families who had service members in their families, and they felt that being evicted, was that it was sort of their patriotic duty to, if they were being asked to move by the government, they should do so. But others spent, up years, sometimes in some cases, in court trying to recover the value of the land that they had taken away from them. We have I mentioned the Native American tribes, but this was some accommodations were made for the tribes, but this was incredibly disruptive for them. This Gable Mountain was a sacred place for the tribes. It was a sacred meeting place. The Columbia River at Vernita was a place where different tribes came together once or twice a year to trade and to, sort of interact with each other and so forth. So, the human impact just of the establishment of the site was dramatic. And that's to say nothing of, the ongoing impacts, environmental impacts, and the impacts of the water and the land and so on and so forth. And the centuries that this land will have to be off limits to people because of this, because of what happened there. Now, that said, we can't underestimate or downplay how many people and how people felt at the time that, there was really a great sense of urgency, that it was critical that this happen. Even if people didn't know what it was, they knew that it was an important part of the war effort, and they felt very strongly that it was important for that reason. And my colleague Anna King tells a nice story about our Senator Patty Murray being sort of the scold of the U.S. Senate when people start talking about cutting the cleanup budget at Hanford. Patty Murray is the one who goes around reminding her fellow senators that it was our government who made the mess here, and it is our government who continues to have the obligation to clean up this mess. So it's a profoundly complicated question, and the human impacts, yes, they've been absolutely extensive. And I talked about a little bit about the unintended consequences, and there were many of those, and many of them were negative and unfortunate, and many of them also were, positive and were sort of breakthroughs in new technologies and new science. So it's a very complicated question, but it's a great question, Mary.
Thank you, Dr. Mays. We actually had a follow-up question with that, and Mary was also interested in how you'd view the radiation impacts with that human impact legacy.
Well, I think that's a really complicated question too. And I wish that, this would be an appropriate question for a panel discussion that included some downwinders and some scientists and, people who had a lot better, far more well-informed understandings of these issues than I do. I am not a scientist. I'm an English professor who pretends to be a historian, and that's kind of a stretch for me, but I certainly never pretend to be a scientist. And so, I'm not trying to skirt the question, but I mean, clearly there have been communities and people who have been impacted by the radiation, by radiation exposures, incidental ones that were, sort of planned and kept secret from us. So, it's tragic, but and there's no, excusing it, but it's also very controversial about the extent to which, how much damage has been caused. And, I just have to leave that to others to with more authority to be able to speak about the science of all of that. So I hate to, sort of wriggle off the hook here or wiggle off the hook, but I just don't feel, that I have the sort of expertise to be able to speak on that, other than in very general ways.
We're just throwing you all the hard questions right there, Dr. Mays.
That's fine.
I wanted to reach out to any of our other viewers, see if they had any further questions for Dr. Mays. If you do, you can type those into that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I'll give it a moment to see if we have any new ones pop up.
Hi, Carson, this is Kelly. I just wanted to let you know we have the ability to allow guests to speak.
Okay, so if you have a question and would like to make an appearance on the talk tonight, make sure you put your question in the box. I'll give it about another minute or so to see if we have any last few coming in. And while we're waiting to see if we get any more questions, I had a question for you, Dr. Mays. In your bio, you mentioned that your book had just been released this past August, and I was just curious if there's any new kind of projects you guys are working on potentially for a volume 3, or
yeah, great question. Yeah, we don't have we with the COVID disruption, our pipeline sort of came to a little bit of a standstill. It's made collaborating on projects a little bit more difficult, but yeah, we have there's a history of Reactor, which is out in the last 2 years by Mark Smith and Bob Ferguson, called something. Oh, I can't think of the title of the book now right off the top of my head. It's not actually part of the Hanford Histories series, but it's supported and sponsored by us. There will be another volume coming in the not too distant future, which will be an oral history of the reactor. And we're in the planning stages for a couple of more volumes, one which continues the history from the 1960s on up into the 1970s, and then another volume which is going to focus on the cleanup and what's going on with the cleanup and so forth. So we're always on the lookout for manuscripts. We're we certainly would love to take a look at work that people are doing. So we're sponsors of research, and we're an outlet for people who are doing research. And so we're always looking for new work by whether that's public history, whether it's academic scholarship. We're sort of wide open as long as it has to do with, our scope.
That's great. Thank you so much for answering my question. Looking at our question and answer section, I think we have hit on all of those questions in there. Dr. Mays, I want to thank you so much for speaking with us all tonight about the Hanford Project. I've definitely learned a whole lot more than I ever thought I would about this whole topic. And for all of our guests who are still online, I just want to thank you all so much for joining us, and make sure you register for our December history talks. Again, you can register through our website at lacymuseum.org or through the City of Lacey's Facebook page. Just look for the events page for our history talks. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Carson, and thank you, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you very much.